Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to Model Building. In this episode, I'm going to continue to work on my N-scale narrow gauge 260 steam locomotive. So far in this build, I've modified an N-scale Rivarossi 040 boiler to fit my Marklin Z 260 mechanism. I've added a 3D printed cab from Shapeways, reworked some details, and added more details on top of the boiler. In the last episode, I added a pilot and a working front coupler. My goals for this episode are to install the remaining details on the locomotive, make an uncoupling lever for the pilot, and fabricate steam cylinders and an air reservoir. On Shapeways, I found something being sold as Nn3 conversion parts. The 3D printed set includes the cab that I fitted in the last episode. It also includes a tender body, some details including a smokestack and domes, and a pilot. As it stands right now, the locomotive cab, smokestack, and headlight are not permanently attached. I'm going to leave the smokestack and headlight off until after the model is painted, but I would like to attach the cab to the boiler. Before I do that, I want to add some freestanding handrails. The Rivarossi boiler already had cast-on handrails. Because it would be difficult to remove them without destroying a lot of the other detail on the boiler, I chose to leave them in place. I still think the model will look better overall with some freestanding handrails. This is Gold Medal Models Part 160-42. It has a number of photo etch details for steam locomotives, including handrail stanchions. I'll start by drilling a series of number 78 holes in the boiler for the stanchions. The molded-on handrails actually make a good guide for the stanchion locations and help to keep the drill bit from wandering. After drilling 4 holes per side, I'll cut the stanchions from the fret using a hobby knife. I'm cutting them from row number 9, which are the smallest ones. I'll put a drop of CA glue on a piece of scrap plastic. Then I'll grip each stanchion in some needle nose pliers and dip the mounting pin in the CA. Now I can insert the stanchions into the holes that I drilled in the boiler. This is what it looks like after the stanchions are in place. I'm going to make the handrails from some 8/1000 brass wire. I'll start by threading the wire through the holes in the stanchions on one side. I'll make a simple right angle bend across the smoke box front. Now comes the tricky part. I'll need another right angle bend in just the right spot. After trimming the end, I have a piece that looks like this. With both ends threaded through the stanchions, it looks like the handrails I've seen in the photos of a number of small steam locomotives. I was originally thinking to drill holes in the cab front for the handrails, which is why I haven't glued it on yet. Now that I'm holding the model in my hand, I think it'll look just as good with the wire just touching the cab. It's also probably a little safer not to drill unnecessary holes in the fragile 3D printed cab. I've removed the handrails and stored them with the other parts I have for this model. I'll use tiny drops of CA to tack glue the cab to the boiler. It's important to check and make sure that it's not crooked. I'm also looking for a tight fit where the boiler meets the cab front. This is looking good to me so far. CA dries quickly, but just to be on the safe side, I'll leave the glue to dry overnight before handling the model. With the cab now attached to the boiler, I'll reinforce the bond with some more CA on the inside. Someone suggested that the brittle 3D printed parts can be strengthened by coating them with CA. I'll apply a small amount to the inside of the cab. I have to be careful to make sure it just coats the parts and doesn't leak out through the windows. I want to add an uncoupling lever to the pilot. I'll start by drilling a pair of small holes with a number 78 drill bit. Now I'll take a piece of the same brass wire I used for the handrails and make a 90-degree bend on one end. Using the model's pilot as a guide, I'll make another bend. I've made more bends using the tips of my pliers to gauge the length. I'll take 2 of the shortest handrail stanchions and 1 of the shorter pin pullers from the Gold Medal model's fret. I've threaded the pin puller onto the uncoupling lever and taped it upside down to a piece of scrap plywood. I'll apply some flux and then solder the pin puller to the uncoupling lever. This didn't work the first time and I had to reheat the joint several times to get it in the right place. Now I've threaded 1 short stanchion onto each end of the uncoupling lever. The stanchions will fit into the holes that I drilled in the pilot. Unfortunately, they fall off the thin wire uncoupling lever rather easily. After several failed attempts to put both stanchions in the holes before gluing, I changed tactics. I put 1 stanchion in one of the holes with a drop of CA on the end and let it dry. Then I carefully threaded the uncoupling lever through with the loose stanchion on it. Even this required some trial and error, but I did get it to go in. A drop of CA will secure it. More CA will keep the uncoupling lever from moving around. It was not the easiest job, but I think the end result looks pretty good. The European-style steam cylinders on the model don't really look right for a 19th century North American narrow gauge locomotive. I don't want to risk messing with this tiny mechanism, but it should be possible to add some cosmetic pieces to change the look. After scouring my stash of supplies, I found some pieces of brass tubing in different sizes. This one is 1/8 inch outside diameter. It looks to be about the right size for the cylinders. The tubing is similar in size to the cylinders from this old Atlas 060 tank engine. I also found this piece, which is the next size up. Conveniently, the two will telescope together. I'm going to use my razor saw and miter box to cut some thin slices of the larger tubing. After cleaning up the pieces with a file, I'll slip them over the smaller piece of tubing. These pieces will form the ridges on each end of the cylinder. This looks like it could work. I'm going to go ahead and solder these pieces together. I've cut a small piece of 5/1000 sheet brass to use for the front end of the cylinder. I'll solder it on. Now I can cut off most of the excess material with shears. The 1/8 inch tubing fits perfectly in my motor tool. I can use the tool like a mini lathe to remove excess solder and match the cylinder end perfectly to the rest of the assembly. I made 2 of these. I marked the sides that I want facing out with a pencil. To fit over the existing cylinders, I'll need to notch the backs of the brass pieces that I made. I'll start by using a fiber-reinforced cutoff wheel in my motor tool. It's important to cut little bits at a time and go slowly to prevent heat buildup. If the part gets too hot, the solder can melt and it will come apart, as I found out the hard way. If there's anything good about wrecking something that you fabricated, it's that you can fabricate another. The more you make, the faster it goes. I'll finish up with files. Now I can cut them to length. This is the finished part, and this is what it looks like mocked up on the model. I used some sandpaper to roughen up the outside of the factory cylinders a little. This should help the gluing process, as the plastic is very slick. I've used a tiny dab of 2-part epoxy to mount the brass part that I made to the factory cylinder, being careful not to let the glue touch the side rods. I think the result looks pretty good. The brass cylinders do limit the pilot truck swing a little. I pushed the engine around the 8-inch radius curves on our N-scale Siren Creek, the tightest curves on the railroad. The engine was able to go around in both directions without issues. I'm using the same technique to make an air reservoir as I used to make the cylinders. I have several sizes of brass tubing. The main tank body is 3/32. It looks like 7 scale feet is a good length. I'll use some 1/16 tubing for the inside of the tank. After cutting it to length, I'll spin it in my motor tool and round the edges with a file. Now that both ends are rounded slightly, I'll insert some 0.8 mm outside diameter tubing through the hole. I'll solder the pieces together. Then I'll spin them again and use some sandpaper to remove the excess solder. After cutting the inner tubing down, the tank insert is complete. I've cut 2 rings from 1/8 inch diameter tubing to go around the outside of the tank. I'll solder them in place. I've left one end longer so that I can spin it and file and sand the excess solder. I'm also filing the bands a little thinner. This is the inner and outer tank after cutting the outer part to length. I'll use a drop of CA to glue the parts together. The finished tank has just a hint of detail on the ends, which is what I was after. Having the tubing in the center makes it possible to put some wire through to represent plumbing. I'll hold off on actually shaping the wire until later. Here it is mocked up on the locomotive. The engine is now ready for paint. I think it has just enough detail to look good at this small size. So far I've used die-cast metal, styrene plastic, photo-etched brass parts, machined brass parts, and 3D printed material to create this model. Mixing materials is fine so long as the parts can be securely fastened together, and once the model is painted it will look like a single object. Making tiny parts can be taxing and requires patience. Looking at a video like this might make it seem like it's one smooth process from start to finish, but trust me, some of this stuff took me several tries to get it right. A motor tool can be a good makeshift lathe for small parts. I could not have fabricated the steam cylinders of the air reservoir as easily without it. This technique might not work as well in larger scales, as the motor tool can only hold tubing up to 1/8 inch or so. For this project, I've been keeping a tally of how much I've been spending. The total from the last episode was $100. I'm not sure how to accurately calculate the cost for this episode. Most of the parts have either already been factored in or were made from materials and scraps I had on hand. The parts I fabricated are so small that they didn't use much brass, and I have plenty left over for other projects. I'm going to call it $5, but that's really a wild guess. That brings the current total to $105. I'm pretty happy with the progress on the locomotive. Now I need to start working on the tender. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.